Hey everyone, Billy here. Glad you could join us. We have a really great presenter here today, Ajuna Kyaruzi. She kindly put the phonetic pronunciation of her last name in the chat for me, so that helped a lot. But yeah, she will be here. She's from Datadog, and she'll be presenting on from zero to monitored. But before that, I will quickly go through just a few minutes of announcements and news. And for some reason, I've been having an issue in StreamYard where my screen breaks up. But yes, once again, welcome to Kansas City Java Users Group for the April Java meetup. So glad everyone could join us. Come on. And thank you to our sponsors, the CLO Group, for paying for our meetup cost. That is very much appreciated. Just some JDK news. Right now, as of the fourth incubator of the Vector API has been added to JDK 19. So currently, there should be hopefully some more announcements about more jets being added to JDK 19, but for some reason, it's just been a little bit slow at this point. So we'll watch out for that. So unfortunately, not a huge lot of JDK news on at least the good side. Unfortunately, on the bad side, CVE was just announced earlier this week that affected ECDCSA signatures in Java 15 through 18. But the good news is the critical patch update, CPU, has been already released for that. So if you're on Java 17 or 18, those are the only two supported of these kind of versions, make sure to upgrade to the latest April CPU, and that will resolve this issue. And you can find out more about the issue here at this link. For releases, again, not a whole lot I am seeing. The one thing is the Maven Surefire plugin. It is gone to the M6 release, and it's supposedly added or closed out like 100 some odd issues. It seems to be on a very slow release cycle, and I guess the Maven Surefire and failsafe plugins, they should be released to full GA here sometime. I think next year is even what I saw. So yeah, it's on a really slow release cycle, but hopefully it'll be released here and can give some updates and uses for the Surefire plugin. But yeah, otherwise I'm not seeing a whole lot of big releases. Other news, or I guess in conferences, KCDC is coming back. And we should hopefully by this time, by the end of this month, maybe, have a release of the schedule for KCDC, or at least all the people that will be speaking at it by the end of this month. So yeah, that should be really great. It's great that we're actually, this is one of the first conferences that actually can't come back in person last year, and then we're continuing it this year. So we only missed 2020. But yeah, hopefully be able to see you there. It should be hopefully another great conference. Also, another big Java conference in the area is UberConf, which is July 12th through 15th, which will be in Denver, Colorado. And I can't believe I forgot to include this on this. But also something that's really big is Java 1 is coming back, and that is in October at some point, which again, I really should know this given them an Oracle. So no one tell my boss I kind of forgot this. But yeah, it will be in October in Las Vegas. And of course, it's so great to have Java 1 back. That was a really awesome that it's being brought back this year, that big flagship conference. But yeah, that'll be in October. And then as far as other news for local meetups, we already got next month's meetup set up. Sendil Kumarn, he will be presenting. He's from Uber, and he'll be presenting on building reactive microservices with JHipster and Kubernetes. So that should be also yet another really great presentation. So I hope you can join us there. Let us know in the chat if there is anything that we have missed. Otherwise, I'm going to go ahead and bring on Ajuna. So, hey, Ajuna, thank you for joining us, and I will actually go ahead and add your slide deck to the stream.
Sure.
And I'll go ahead and let you take it from here. So, thank you again.
Awesome. Thanks so much for having me. I'm very excited to be here with everyone. My presentation today is going to be from zero to monitored. So this is a very short overall introduction to monitoring. It's mostly language agnostic, though I've added some beginnings of how to get started with Java specifically, because of course I'm here with you at Casey Jug. And I'll take some questions as we go along. So please put them in the chat. And this is my first time chatting with like a local meetup group. Usually my go-to is like, where are you from? To like get everyone sort of speaking to me. But still, you can tell me where you're from and I'll just see a ton of Kansas cities. That's totally fine. Or at least I'm hoping that you're having a good day overall. But yeah, so I'll get started with introducing myself. So like I said, my name is Ajuna Kyaruzi. I work at Datadog in developer relations. I love working with my hands in my free time, so I really like breaking, doing really bad at crafts, or just like not breaking things, but just like, failing in small cases. I was just at conferences and I really love socks. So if you've seen me at a conference and I was holding socks, that's why. And I volunteer for different things in my free time, like a nonprofit called AfriCode, which helps Africans in tech be successful. But that's close to my heart because I'm originally from Dar es Salaam, Tanzania, and I'm currently based in Atlanta. So I'm very excited to be here with you. I've been to Kansas City before and I've loved it, and I'm hoping to come back. So I'll get started by actually restating the title to From Zero to Monitoring instead. The biggest part of that is because monitored implies that you are done or can be done. That's generally pretty hard to do. Your systems are likely changing constantly. Your needs for your systems and how to keep track of them is also likely changing. And also the monitoring and observability space changes as well. We're getting new things every day. So there's a lot to do. We'll go over some basics. We'll chat a little bit about why they're important. I'd love to hear from you about what monitoring and observability tools that you're currently using, and then we can see where to go from there about when, and the who obviously is us. So to get started, if you have nothing else, and after this talk, and you have your own small application, and all you do is add on Twitter that you'll monitor your name and down, I'll be happy with that. But hopefully during this talk, we'll go over the fundamentals of monitoring, so you'll have a little bit more than that. But, the power of Twitter is real. If you do want to, at the monitor what it says on Twitter and also the other things that we'll discuss, that'll be very good. So where to get started with monitoring or observability overall, which gives you a whole view of your system, not just the things you know about. I'm going to chat mostly about logs, metrics, and traces today. There are other parts that go with observability that we can definitely go into. Application performance monitoring goes hand in hand with tracing a lot, so I'll get into that a little bit. And there are other things that we do care about, especially for larger scale tools. This is mostly assuming that you're going to be getting started maybe with your side project or your application that you're working on by yourself. So definitely the monitoring 101 in a lot of ways. So first, I'll talk about logging, and I love a good pun. So not these logs, but these logs, right? You've likely already seen logs in some way or the other. It can be in real life because there are real human logs. Usually, you can have them on things like ships or just generally a list of things that are going on. If you work in a store, just logs of who's coming in and out. But in computers, logs are a list of things that happen. They're event-based. Generally, whenever something happens, a log should be generated. Ideally, your logs are not only readable, but also very easy to parse, and they contain a lot of detailed information. So on the left, I have different logs, which give you a timestamp as well, the host where that log's coming from, definitely the content of the logs. So when you do click into one of those and you click into a log, it'll give you information of what happened. Generally, this is a lot easier if you do have some sort of structured format like JSON, because then you can get all your information in one place. If you just parse your logs into a file, your logs usually come with a stack trace, especially in Java, and it'll kind of just like have them one after the other. But if you have them in a JSON object, it may be a little easier to kind of keep it as a key value pair, with the value, of course, being the object, right? So as you collect more logs, as you're writing them down, they help you sort of show patterns of things that are going on, and you can also filter them. But if you are getting started with logs, there are a lot of options in Java. Here I have an example of how to add a logger using log4j. There's definitely other, like java.util logging is also a great option. There's options that are specifically for tools like Spring. I think they have SF4j as one of their logging platforms. But generally, you have your function, you create your logger in the class, and you start entering things into the logs, and you'd have different log levels like error. If something went wrong, you can even have info logs, debug logs, and things like that. There's lots of different log levels. So if you do have a lot of logs, I mentioned that you can aggregate them into really cool ways. And this actually can be very helpful for you to see patterns of different types of log events, especially if you start using monitoring tools or platforms. So for example, I have a screenshot here of different logs that have been aggregated together. The count of those are on the left. The color does indicate whether it was what type of status that log was in. So as you can see that we have errors sending notifications. So that's something that you can then get insight on and further go see what the cause of that might be. So you can also alert on logs depending on the log levels. So these are also additional screenshots. The tool that I'm using here is Datadog because I work there and that's what I use, but you can definitely use other platforms as well. So alerting on logs can also be very helpful so that when you do have these error logs, or even some platforms allow you to have like critical logs or emergency logs, you can wake someone up and declare an incident from them. But you then have in this screenshot, we see things like the kind of log that's happening. What was in the log message, the error message, and then get a chance to see the stack and go forward from there. So there's a lot of information you can get from logs, and it can kick you off into other parts of your, if something's wrong, it can kick you off into your incident management as well. So I'm going to jump into metrics real quick next. So metrics are another data type that are helpful when you're talking about observability. So they're a data type that usually consists of a name and a value as well, and a timestamp, but also optionally you can have tags for your metrics. Metrics are data points that we think of a lot when in regards to monitoring. You might have already been using some type of metrics in terms of counters. I know that I used counters a lot when I was working on my applications, just to know, for example, how many users have I gotten? And that was just easy to declare a new counter and then just, increment it whenever you do get the method hit again. But there are more different types of metrics, and we'll go into those. So metrics are also often combined and aggregated, and they can be used in addition to logs. All of these different, what I'll call facets or pillars of observability, are all great to be used together. Metrics generally represent the raw measurements of a resource or a behavior that can be observed. So if you are thinking about using metrics, some things that you can think about is like, what makes a good metric, right? We want to make sure that when we are accumulating this information, we're accumulating them in a way that's helpful to us. For example, we would want to know, we want to understand a metric. We would want to know that when we are using it, the other people that exist on our teams or us later, right? We code with the understanding that us later will not understand what the hell we were talking about. So you want to make sure that when we do create a new metric, it is well understood and it's not vague depending on your perspective, or it could be different depending on your perspective. For example, if you are looking at different latency metrics and you have multiple devices, not putting information on where that metric was coming from can get very vague very quickly, because you might know that your main device that you're logging from is maybe yours, but if you're also running on another server, then it can get very confusing very quickly if one of them is having an error and you can't note it down which one that has a higher level of metrics, for example. Next, we'd also want to make sure that our metrics have sufficient granularity. So I have a screenshot here that's from the Winter Olympics that happened. It's speed skating. So these are all the top 8 folks who finished in the women's speed skating. And actually, they all completed the course within 37 seconds, which is amazing. I'm sure I would take a very long time to complete any course, specifically because I both hate winter and skating. But what's tricky with that is they all completed the course in 37 seconds. So if we didn't have an additional granularity of um, milliseconds, we wouldn't know who won, right? So definitely having additional information makes it a lot easier for us to properly rank the competitors. So thinking about that in more computer terms, here I have 3 different screenshots of CPU utilization. The first one is measuring every second. So we can see that there was a peak about 206, and we can see that there was a peak of 46% utilization, whereas the next one in the middle, we are looking at measuring at a minute granularity. So we do see that there was a peak at 206, but the peak is shorter because it has been averaged between all those 60 seconds in the 2:06 p.m. time frame. And then if we do go in the third chart all the way at the bottom, where we're um, recording at every 5 seconds, we actually don't see the peak at all because it has been averaged out. So then you don't even know that there was a peak. So definitely how much or the increments of which you are recording your information definitely matters. So next, we would want our logs to be tagged and filterable, our metrics to be tagged and filterable. I told you before that we'd want metrics to have tags if we can. At Datadog, we love tags. There's tags everywhere, and we use those to combine different information together. And here I have a picture of, it's actually a little sticky note whenever someone died in the Game of Thrones series, and obviously they're color coded based on books. So visually, one, it's very interesting to see it all happen, right? But also, if you're very curious about a particular death because you forgot and wanted to know more details about one particular character who passed away and when, you can actually maybe even write on those sticky notes to know that. But generally, just being able to see it from a view and go in deeper makes life a lot easier for everyone. So going back to our example earlier of making sure that our metrics are well understood, we if we had machines that were both feeding us metrics, if we tagged them based on where they were, then that metric would be automatically well understood because we would know for latency metrics which machine that was coming from. Tags also make it easier to create things like dashboards and alerts, which are helpful, and I'll go into those a little bit more as we keep going. But if you're able to add tags to your metrics or everything, I'm definitely a big fan of. Lastly, a good quality for our metrics are making sure that they're long-lived. So this depends on your ability to store data, of course, but if you discard your data too soon, or you aggregate it in a way that you lose some information, it can be really hard to understand what's going on. For example, if you own a store and you're trying to see how many folks you get with that counter that you've set up every day at your web store, and you aggregate it after a while to monthly, which is great. But then you it's November is coming up and you want to know how many people came to your store for Black Friday last year. Because you aggregated it for November, it can be really hard for you to know exactly for what that was. So maybe you got so many visitors last Black Friday that people weren't able to access your store. So you wanted to know and prepare better this year. So being able to have your metrics live long enough that you can know from important dates like Black Friday or Cyber Monday, and not just an aggregate of, I'm being optimistic to say per month, right? You could even aggregate it per quarter or per year, depending on your needs. That can get it pretty hard. So you need to decide for yourself based on your abilities and your resources, but also what you're able to do. But keeping your metrics as long as you can definitely makes a huge impact. So taking this into specifically for Java, one of the best tools that I've seen for using metrics is called Micrometer. So Micrometer has three different types of metrics. So we talked about this middle one, which is counters, which is literally for measuring the number of events that happened. Um, so it's most helpful for a value that increases and doesn't decrease. But we also have other types of metrics like a gauge metric, which is helpful for measuring things like resource usages. So it can kind of go up and down. And they generally have fixed upper bounds. So gauge is really awesome for that. So number of threads, the size of a collection are all very helpful to use with a gauge metric. And then you can also have a timer metric, which helps you measure shorter duration events, so like execution time, resource time, and so forth. So if you were wanting to get started with using Micrometer, here's an example where you, of course, um, create your new class and you create a dictionary, for example, and you create your meter registry, which is how Micrometer instruments things. And you can actually then, with your, if you want to note how your dictionary is doing, you can create a new gauge metric and add it to the registry where you look at things like dictionary size over time. You can even add tags to this, which is awesome. And yeah, that's a great way to get started with Micrometer. So when we usually think of metrics, we definitely think of dashboards. Dashboards are very helpful to track our metrics over time, and also for us to highlight the things that we care about the most. They're very easy for us to share information about the metrics we care about to other people who might care about them as well. For example, if you work in a team, I've definitely worked in places where we had a lovely dashboard on a monitor nearby so we could see how things are doing. And then obviously you don't want to keep an eye on it all the time, but it can help you see the general trends. So if you know that you get a spike in traffic every day around noon p.m. Eastern, because that's when folks in the Pacific time zone are waking up, that's generally then you get these common graphs that can go on, which can be really cool. So lastly, I want to talk about traces. And traces were the part of observability that was the newest to me when I was getting started with it. And that's because I just had never played around with it before. So a trace is generally a collection of data kind of related to end-to-end requests within an application. So a trace is sort of this total picture that we see here. It's made up of one or more calls where we can actually call, they're called spans, where each span is a call within the request, right? And it traces the entire part of it. So for example, a call can be a sub function call or a microservice. And the general structure of a trace sort of looks like this, where there's a top one that the first span in the trace, and we usually call this the root span or the parent span. And then we have one or more child spans that go with it. Where traces are really helpful is they sort of show you where you spend your time in a request. So they're very helpful to understand if there are any bottlenecks that are happening for a particular request that you have. And also just it gives you a better understanding of what your functions are doing, especially if you're working on a very, very large function that you might have been building for a really long time. It can get a bit unruly to realize what that function actually ends up calling, especially if you're trying to update your code in some way and you don't realize the effects that it might have. Tracing is very helpful for that and for just debugging in general. So getting started usually includes a sort of include or import statement, and usually traces have what we define as a request ID that's attached to them. So when you're defining your code, you kind of have a trace ID that gets sent out with each call request that you have. And that's where you pass that trace ID to each subcall. And that's how you get an information about for each of those calls, which are the subcalls that it made. And when it completed, it goes back and gets you this sort of tree-like graph that we're seeing here. So here is an example of a real life trace where we do see this breakdown, right? So um, we have our application here that's for showing us it's a web store. It's showing us that we made a call, like a get call, and then it showed us the index, and then it opened up and showed us all these subcalls that went down after that. So if one of these is running for longer than you expect, it definitely makes it a lot easier for us to know where that could be coming from. Um, Traces are very helpful to triage elevated error rates and performance regressions. And obviously, you can also use them alongside logs and metrics. So if you then find out that one of your calls was running longer than you expected, if you are generating logs and metrics with that, you can go in deeper, especially with your logs, to see what happened for that request and then resolve it. But you can know exactly which call generated it from something like traces. Or you could probably find that out with logs by themselves, but this can help you get there faster. So there are a lot of options for getting started with traces. You can use Micrometer. They do have a traces option, but one great option that's open source is OpenTelemetry. So OpenTelemetry is an open source project that is used for all observability. It's a joint effort by a lot of different observability and telemetry companies, and they do have a tracing component. So you can definitely use that. So in this example, we see that it creates a tracer. Um, and it locks that into this class that we're looking at, with it, which is called Jaeger example. And then for a particular function in there, we generate a span within that class, and we add in information when we do create some subcalls. So do work is a subcall, and you add an event to the trace. And then in the next function that we see, the do work does work, right? So you can even add another trace in there in case it does other things or like call something else. So then when you're done with everything, you can sort of see the breakdown that looks like the graph that I showed earlier. So where traces are really helpful is they go along with something called application performance monitoring, which gives you additional information, including how different parts of your services work together. So I did say that with traces, you can see what things call another. So if you do have a complicated web store, you can see how everything sort of connects together. And here's a screenshot that I took from Datadog, and it's actually color coded, so you can see if there is an error for a particular component within your service. And you can obviously zoom into this and filter on different things like service names and stuff, but it can help you see if you do have an error, where it's coming from downstream between services. And then you can go in further and look at additional information with your traces. And if you have connected your traces with your logs, you can actually see you can click on a particular trace on the tool that you're using, and then see the logs that were coming from that trace underneath, which I talked earlier can be really helpful to get information faster. So going over all of these sort of beginning tools of observability, then the next question can sort of be like, why it matters, right? And for that, I want to talk a little bit about service level objectives, indicators, and agreements, which sort of all go hand in hand. And you may have heard of one of these at some point. So a service level indicator, it's usually a metric. So it's a quantitative measure of some sort of attribute of a service. So it's a metric that users definitely care about. So this can be like percentage of requests that take place in like less than 5 minutes, but more than 100 milliseconds, for example. And then we have SLOs, which are these SLIs or metrics at a specific target. So you do put them into, we want to say that we want to know how many of our metrics are less than 5 minutes, because users will be very annoyed at us if it takes, how many of our requests take longer than 5 minutes, because users will care whether we have requests that take too long. And then you have these things called an SLA, which are your service level agreements. So these are consequences when you miss your SLO, right? So if your SLO is violated, or you miss the target, you may need to actually pay money, especially if you are a company like that provides a service to someone else. So if you're an AWS or a Datadog or something that is like a SaaS, especially, but honestly, anything, if you do have users who pay to use your service. They don't have to be other software companies. They can be anybody. And they're paying you to use their service with the expectation that you're going to be available at least 90% of the time, and you're not, and they're paying for that, then an SLA means that if you do miss the target of being available 90%, which is actually quite low, usually it's like 99.9 or 99.99 or something. If you do miss that target, then you have to pay them money. So SLOs provide a good framework for defining clear targets around performance or just how your system is doing. And the reason I bring this up in relation to monitoring is usually we want to monitor what's going on with our systems, especially if we've gotten to the place where we have users that care about how we're doing. And SLOs and SLAs really give us a good indication. Sometimes they're even implied where users expect us to do things, and you can't have them implied or not if you're not having monitoring. You need to know what's going on with your system before you can make promises on how well it's going to work. So it's definitely SLOs work very hand in hand with your metrics or your other types of monitoring and observability tools, because they all affect what our users what our users expect from our system's behavior. Another aspect that does go hand in hand with monitoring, and it's why we should pay attention to it, is also alerting. So we want to know when our system isn't doing well. Alerting is sort of the responsive component of a monitoring system, and it generally performs actions based on these changes in our values, especially in our metrics, but also I showed logs alerts as well. So there's different types of alerts. You can have a condition or a threshold where if your metric crosses a particular threshold or it falls outside acceptable conditions that we've created, we want the computer to let us know, right? Because we don't want to watch our dashboards 24/7. So you let the computer know, hey, if the threshold is crossed, let me know in this way, page me, or let me know by a ticket or anything else. You can sort of decide on things like log level, how you want to get notified when something does happen. So to be clear though, alerting and paging are not exactly the same. You want to alert on a lot of different things, but you don't always want to wake someone up. And the log level example is really helpful here, right? If you do just have an info log, you definitely don't want to let anyone know that. An info log would like tell you that, hey, your service completed successfully. No one likely needs to be woken up for that. Or if you have failed within your target, like if you have promised that you'll be available 90% of the time and you are only available 92% of the time, yeah, that's close, but you probably want to investigate it, but not wake someone up. So it's very helpful to also, when you're configuring your alerts, to look at the different ways that you do want to notify people that don't only equate to paging. Some things could wait until the next day, especially if it's 3 a.m. Another aspect that I love to talk about as well is that it's from this tweet. So it says that things were unstable for a bit, but we fixed them. By fixing, they adjusted the monitoring threshold so they would shut up. So the reason I bring this up is because pager fatigue is real, and that's another aspect of watching out on what type of alerts that you want to do. If things are unstable because your monitoring thresholds were wrong, so either that means that you didn't have them equate on what users expect, or they were too high, so you don't want to constantly fix them. Maybe it's time to think about what your users actually expect, and if they're constantly being crossed, spending time to fix the underlying issues on improving your reliability of your service rather than constantly fixing your alert threshold so they're no longer waking you up. So we talked about the different tools of monitoring and what they are, why it matters. So next it's a when. When to start monitoring really does sort of depend on you. I talked about SLOs earlier because I think that if you do end up having an SLO, you should be monitoring by then. But generally, the earlier you start monitoring, the better it is for yourself. Just to know as you're improving your service, how and what ways are necessary to improve so you can scale even faster. But if money's definitely on the line, monitoring sooner than that is very helpful. And if you don't know where to get started, there are definitely key areas that you can start monitoring in. So there are these things called the four golden signals, which is just one framework of getting started with observability, but definitely looking at things like latency, errors, traffic, and saturation. So this is definitely with both metrics and with logs, but just looking at things like the time it takes to service requests, how many requests of those are failing, how much demand you're getting, how full, how full your computer that is handling those requests is, are all great ways of getting started to look at how your service is doing, and then you can build on from there based on what your users really care about. So there's a saying that collecting data is cheap and not having it when you need it is expensive. And this definitely kind of goes along with what I mentioned of like when to start monitoring. If you are having an outage and it is affecting you, not I have said financially, but it could even just mean in user trust, right? Where people just are like, this is really unreliable, I never want to use it. That can end up being very expensive. So as much as you're able to put aside to collect your data for any project, even the side project that you're working on by yourself, it can be super helpful to know what is going on with your system. So collect as much data as you can, or slightly more than you think that you'll need. So I talked already about these tooling options, but kind of putting them all together. If you are looking at an enterprise level of observability, there are a lot of tools out there, including Datadog. There are open source versions like OpenTelemetry. There is open source application monitoring like Micrometer, which can help you get started with metrics, and they do also have tracings. You can always build your own. That is always an option, and there are a lot of cool ways to get started with that. Java Management Extensions, or JMX, is a great framework to expose your metrics for traces, and even all of these tools that I talked about use some level of that, but you can definitely build your own to look at how those are doing and add your own alerting to it. But if you're also curious about which one to pick, you can find something which has an integration with your existing services. So if you're using Spring or Tomcat, you can look at which ones support Spring or Tomcat and get metrics directly from them as well to get started. Like Spring works really well with Micrometer. There's actually the Spring Actuator. When you import that into your project, it has Micrometer already in place. For example, and OpenTelemetry supports both, Datadog supports both, but definitely kind of mixing and matching to know where to get started is really helpful. Once you do sort of have these in your system, you can even kind of go forward from there. Metrics, logs, and tracers are just one way to get started with SLOs and alerting supporting them. There's also real user monitoring, which helps you know more information, for example, of like who are reaching out to your service, where are they coming from, what device are they using, which can all be really helpful to find out that if Android users in South India have a terrible experience and sort of spend less time on your site than any other users in that area, that's something that real user monitoring can let you know about, which can be very helpful as you continue to scale if that's an area you care about. Synthetics is really helpful for things like UX testing, just to kind of see how your system is doing and test it out as you're continuing to build. Security is definitely a part of observability because you want to know things like if your metrics are a lot higher than they usually are because you are experiencing some sort of attack. I talked about Log4j earlier. Security definitely, they had a pretty bad, they had a pretty bad, I'm sorry, I'm missing the word right now. They had a pretty bad security outage, an exploit, I think that is the word I was looking for. That had a really bad exploit recently, and they patched it very quickly. But security definitely can help you realize when things like that are going on, because it can happen to anyone. And knowing what's going on. Yes, Log4Shell. Thank you. knowing what's going on so that you can react from that quickly is very helpful. But yeah, network monitoring also exists, database monitoring. You can always work on your dashboards, especially if they're going to be part of your decor for your office to see what's going on. But this definitely happens. So I'm going to stop here and open it up for questions. I can see them in the comments, which I'm very happy to sort of chat through. Or if we don't have time, I'll also have, you're welcome to email me or find me on the socials too.
Nice. That was a great presentation. Maybe while giving some people a chance to type out some questions, because it's a few minutes late, I do have a few kind of myself. So one question, and sometimes you kind of use both of the terms, and I've always kind of found them slightly interchangeable, or sometimes I always kind of forget, is like, what's the difference between monitoring and observability? Or do you think there is like a major distinction?
So different people think differently on this one. I sort of think of monitoring as being the focused more on the tools. So it kind of lets you know when something is wrong. It really goes hand in hand with alerting to kind of know where your thresholds are and stuff. Whereas observability can help you know more about like why something is wrong and gives you a deeper insight into more information on how your system overall is doing, not just the ones that you've already set alerts on. Observability can help you find out the things that you don't know to alert on yet.
Okay.
But a lot of people have different options with that. I think that it's kind of, it really depends.
Yeah, I gotcha.
Yeah.
So I guess another question is, so you were talking about granularity earlier, and maybe like how do you kind of figure out maybe how granular do you go? Like I think you also mentioned that, or I think it's in your bio that you used to work at Google. Like I don't
Yes.
know if anything from, and that's definitely at a much, at least as far as when I was engineering, like that was always at a much larger scale than I ever really worked at. So like kind of what was some maybe practices at like Google when it came for figuring out granularity or something like that? Was it just get everything down to the millisecond level, or was there maybe some practices of like, oh, okay, this can be a millisecond, this can be a minute, or something like that? Or
I hate to say like it depends, but it really does.
Yeah.
There are sort of things that you definitely do care about to have a finer level of granularity on. So it also depends on your usage as well. So if you know that, how can I sort of describe it? If you know how many requests you get per hour generally, and it doesn't really overwhelm your system too much, then recording it not hourly, but maybe a little bit less than that is probably all right, where we're talking about minutes. But if you do know that you're getting millions of requests at a time, definitely recording per second totally makes a difference. But I don't really
Yeah.
have any go-tos that I can share with anyone at this point, because the size of the organization totally matters, and your ability to spend money keeping that information, also like storing it, also really does matter.
Yeah.
So I'm sad to say that I don't have any kind of best practices, but I can look into them and get back and write an article about it, or let you know
Yeah.
if there's a specific one that you care about.
Well, I think you kind of did maybe bring up a good one there, where I think a lot of that will come down to maybe how many requests you're getting for that service. You know, if you're only getting dozens of requests, you know, per hour, or whatever kind of, you know, measure you want, then that probably means you don't necessarily need the per second necessarily. But if you are
Yeah.
getting, you know, really that big scale of, you know, thousands or millions of requests an hour or something, then you would need some of that smaller scale. So actually that was pretty useful. I do also, you were also talking about SLA, SLOs, SLIs, and SLA. So like,
Yes.
how do you think like that can, is there any good practices for how that's to be arrived? Because a lot of times, at least in my experience, it's just been like the business person's like, yeah, it should just be up 100% of the time, you know? I'm like,
Yeah.
yeah, that's not always possible. So yeah, like has there been any in your experience of ways of like, okay, this can be 98% or 95 or anything kind of like that on how that can be figured out? I know a
Yeah.
lot of that be business as well, but I just don't know if there's anything else.
No, I understand. And I love talking about SLOs. It's one of my favorite topics. I think that in general, one of it is just what do your users care about? So you can sort of build from there. We all wish that we had 100% reliability of everything, but generally it's very expensive. The way
Hmm.
that you're able to get closer to 100% is by having a ton of redundancy
Hmm.
and failovers, so that if you have multiple servers, if one goes over, you're still able to stay reliable, and that's just expensive. So I really love referencing this. It's called the availability table that Google has a really great SRE book.
Okay.
So they show you like, where, oh, I have to switch tabs. Sorry, here we go. It shows you for different unavailability what that means for different periods of time. And I
Hmm.
think that that's always like can help you sort of get started with what you think. Because if your users don't care that for 2 hours a month they can't access your service, for example, my bank is not accessible every other Saturday at like 3 a.m. Eastern, and I'm totally fine with that.
Yeah.
However, if you have like global coverage, so there is someone who it's noon all the time and that's their working hour, then maybe you can't have 2 hours of downtime a month.
Hmm.
Um, so I think it's best when your SLOs and SLAs your SLOs come from your product owners, and actually your SLAs should be less strict than your SLOs,
Okay.
because you might miss your SLOs, but you don't want to lose money for it. So you still want a little bit of wiggle room between your SLO ends and where your SLA actually will be crossed by your users. But user happiness is what is the driving factor for that. So what is people's experience with your product? Um, and then you kind of see to go from there. If you just have like a small application that only people in your time zone use, you could probably be out from 2 a.m. to 4 a.m. almost every day, and very few people would really, really notice.
Hmm.
So you could probably keep it in this like 90% availability space.
Yeah.
Um, then, yeah. Whereas if like when WhatsApp was down for a while, everyone knew. um, yeah, so that's or yeah that's what the sort of scale that I'm looking at for determining it. But I think this is really helpful to know
Yeah.
which one you sort of fall into as a
Yeah.
starting point. We can get to 100. You just keep adding nines, and the time per year just decreases. Like this is 5 minutes a year. If you have
Yeah.
this called 5 nines of availability, which is kind of crazy.
But yeah, no, that's also a good point. That also a lot of times who your user base is or really where they're located can also really affect what you really need to go for. Because yeah,
Mhm.
if your user base is like all based in the US or it's all in a local area, then yeah, like you're saying, it's not going to be too much of an issue if your service maybe is down during the middle of the night when everyone's probably asleep. You're not going to
Yeah.
get that many calls if you're down during that time.
You're also going to be down for things other than like outages.
Hmm.
There are going to be system maintenance that you have to do that you usually need to bake into things like your SLA. So
Hmm.
people know that that's what our banks do, right? Um, and then there are, yeah, so there are different small reasons other than just like massive outages that happen. If you
Yeah.
actually have to like switch from Python 2 to Python 3, for example,
Yeah.
or anything else that just happens. You need to kind of bake that into it too, not just
Yeah. No,
when you have an
that's
outage.
great points as well. So we did get a question.
Okay.
How do you search or index on trace spans?
Um, I guess I'm confused by what you mean by search.
I guess
Um,
maybe how you could maybe filter through them, but I guess it could be also very context specific or
mhm.
yeah. Uh,
uh,
I guess maybe somewhat some on a topic. So like maybe in your experience, like when has there ever been a time when like a trace has really helped you find like a bottleneck in your service, or Do you have like any interesting stories around something like that, or?
Yeah. So, for example, where traces can be really helpful is to know that. Okay, example when it's really helped me. I made a new. I had to update one of the um, a function that I was using because the old one wasn't as quick in some ways. So I made
Mm-hmm.
a separate function and it was slowly transferring over some of my services to use the new one. And then I started having some outages when I thought I'd already transferred all of them. And traces helped me know that that was because there was something that was calling the old function that was now deleted. So that's
Mm-hmm.
one way that it's been really helpful. But it sort of
Yeah.
comes up all the time where you just assume that there's a call that should take no time and there's a hidden wait in like a sub function
Mm-hmm.
somewhere, and then it just the wait is like 5 seconds and you're all of a sudden you're like, why is the whole function 5 seconds slower than it
Yeah.
should be?
Yeah, I
um,
remember at one point I was doing some research in this area, where I hadn't done many traces before. Uh, so yeah, I guess you said like, for example, finding a specific trace for a specific request. Um, yeah, I don't know if like, I guess could be about maybe putting good ID generators in there or something
uh,
like that, or
Okay, I think this will also kind of determine on the tool that you have. A
yeah.
lot of the traces that we use at Datadog kind of are tagged based on the function that they have. So usually you go in and look at for the function or the service, and then kind of go deeper and look at the root trace, and then find the one that might be that might be too long. Generally, also, if there is an alert when you're using something like Datadog, it'll link you to all of the relevant information, including the traces and logs will be attached to it. So I've never had to go like literally index by index to find a trace, um, but I can look into that deeper. If Ross, you want to email me your specific situation, I can try to help you figure it out as well.
Nice.
Um, yeah.
Yeah. Yeah, I just remember one time when I was looking at traces, or kind of about the prospect of traces, because some of this stuff was kind of still immature when last I did in engineering. And like one area that could be helpful that I know it probably would have went down like a bad rabbit hole
Mhm.
is it can, like I said, that the whole timing it can show you to where it's like, oh, you may look in the logs and maybe some call is being made a bunch of times and it may be hard to know, but with a trace, it might just be like, oh, all those calls like added up to like 1 millisecond combined. And but really the big areas may be in some other location. So like that, I don't know, at least that's why I was like, oh yeah, that could be really helpful. Traces, they can make sure you don't go down rabbit holes. So
Yeah,
yeah,
absolutely.
yeah. So I guess yeah, Ross. It looks like he is maybe having a very maybe specific request. I don't know. Yeah, that might be good um, for an
Um,
email, or I'm not sure. Or yeah,
let
so
me.
do you have metadata like an order ID tied to a trace? I'm guessing the answer is yes. Or
Yeah, yes, you can, but it really depends on the tool that you're using. So, for example, let me go back to my presentation on getting started with traces. So, I mean, a payload is really helpful if you already have that attached to the request. Then the trace ID is tied to that individual request. So then those two things are tied together. So if you do have which trace you're looking for, you can then go in and look at I meant this tab. So here, this is very basic, right? So it's just showing you create a trace that's identified with a span. Create a span that's identified with this trace. But if you did have a payload, like which was where I would put metadata, or sorry, I use those words very interchangeably, then those two things are sort of tied together. But look,
great.
which slide was I? So for example, this slide, the way that the logs are tied to this particular trace is with that trace ID. So the logs might even have the metadata that you're looking for.
Awesome. All right. Yeah, hopefully that kind of answers some of Ross's questions. Um, I guess that's it. Is there anything else you would like to share, or?
Um, Not specifically. Like I'll always love talking about this. So if anyone does want to continue the conversation, very happy to. If you have any feedback, I'd also would love it. I generally, like I said, have this talk quite language agnostic, and it was really fun narrowing it down to be more Java specific. But in a future case, I'm hoping to like create a Java application, then slowly break down how I added additional monitoring. But that's a V2 sort of situation. Yeah.
Nice. Well, maybe I guess when V2 is ready, we'll maybe have you back. But I guess
I would
until
be
then,
honored.
awesome.
Yeah.
All right. Well, that was a great presentation. And, well, thank you again, Ajuna. I think with that, we'll go ahead and end the live stream. So until next time, see everyone. Bye.
Thank you. Bye.